Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. This week I'm going to re-release a video I made years ago, right? Way back when, right? But I kind of like this video because it's one of the very first videos I ever made. Obviously, this video and lots of other videos were taken down way back when because YouTube found them all these videos and stuff way too offensive and all that stuff back in the day. But I'm going to really release it because it's not that bad of a video. Um, it's really simple, by the way. Like, obviously, I think I've somewhat improved my editing and stuff since then. And if I could make changes now, of course, I would make changes to that video. But, I like it. It's a little bit of my own personal history. And I think it makes some fair arguments or whatever I was trying to say back then. So, guys, hopefully you enjoyed the video and all the best.
Today, I'd like to cover Fedelmid Crimthainn. He's an exceptionally interesting character, and there is much to say about him that many people seem to forget or skim through. So today, I'd like to isolate and focus on this topic. When reviewing Fedelmid, two questions always arise from historians. The first one being, is the blatant attacks on other Irish when Fedelmid never attacks Viking rivals. The second one being, is Fedelmid the first historical king of Ireland? These questions are very interesting, and there are two questions I'd like to dive in. This is a part of a series of videos I am doing on the Viking Age. My previous trilogy of videos was on the start of the Viking Age. I'm now moving into the period of war in Ireland. Starting off with Fedelmid. In 770, Fedelmid Crimthainn was born. He was born in the background of fighting between the kingdom in the south of Ireland, the Kingdom of Munster, and the kingdom in the north, the Kingdom of the Uí Néill. In the view of Munster, the Uí Néills were the rightful kings of the north, and they themselves, the Eóganachta, the kings of Munster in the south, they were the rightful kings. And this was the way of life for them. However, in 770, the Uí Néill, the men in the north, felt that they needed to move down south and take over. This started to put extra pressure on, and between 770 and 797, Munster and the Uí Néill in the north would go to war with one another over the kingdom of Leinster. They would fight over the cattle tribute. However, this would leave Munster exceptionally weakened, as Munster would lose two major battles against the Uí Néill. This was also in the background of the rise of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was an ally to Munster, and Munster would be heavily influenced by both Charlemagne and their heavy defeat by the Uí Néill. Since 521, Irish monks had been going into Europe and building many monasteries in Europe and building the foundations of the rebirth of Europe. Ireland had played a major part in this. A good book on this is How the Irish Saved Civilization, and it is a must read. In this, it explains how the Irish would rebuild Europe, and in return, by the age of Charlemagne, Munster had been heavily influenced by the rebirth of Europe and this revival. This reform. This reform would see itself in the law of St. Patrick. An outsider to the Eóganachta, well, the Eóganachta's main circle, Fedelmid was an outsider to the Eóganachta. Although he was related to them, in normal circumstances, he would have never risen to the top. However, during Charlemagne's rise in Europe, and with the defeat by the Uí Néill, Fedelmid himself kept pushing for a reform of the Irish Church, that this was all a punishment from God because we hadn't reformed. Fedelmid would push this agenda again and again, which would make many historians question his rise. Was it political, or did he genuinely believe that this was all a punishment by God and that he was here to reform the church? To do this, he would activate a law of St. Patrick. These laws were laws to enforce the reform of Ireland. Fedelmid would spend the next few years not just in Ireland, but throughout all of Ireland enforcing the law of St. Patrick, which really does push the debate on if he was pushing his agenda to be King of Ireland or if he just looked to save the souls of the Irish people through brute force and brutality. The law of St. Patrick was seen as an extremist law to much of the church. You see, the Irish clergy at the time held on to much wealth and were very rich, and the law of St. Patrick, the reform of the church, would remove the wealth from them. So Fedelmid was seen as an extremist. However, with the reform in both Europe and by the loss of the Uí Néill, Fedelmid easily rose up the ranks in his extremist fashion, shouting and screaming, possibly looking for a high attention, telling people of the end of days and how they deserve this from the wrath of God. In 802, Conchobar of Armagh had appeared from the Uí Néill. He would murder, massacre and butcher both his brothers and fellow O'Neill tribesmen from both north and south, to capture both the kingship of the Uí Néill and the kingship of Tara. Conchobar would also marry and ally himself with Connacht, fusing the two kingdoms into one. Conchobar, for the most part, was king of the north. With the rise of Fedelmid in the south, because of his extremist views, which would eventually see him as king of the Munster, the north, with the rise of Conchobar, would seek more and more men of Munster. Munster would be more than happy to supply these men. However, this would come with a hook. That hook being that Conchobar would have to take part in the law of St. Patrick. He would have to take part in the reform. The reform that was not wanted in the north. The clergy in the north did not want to give up their wealth. They did not want to give up their power, which Fedelmid 100% wanted to pursue and push for. 819, Conchobar had become king of the north, and in 820, Fedelmid had become king of the south. This was the way the Munsterman had seen the world, and Fedelmid and Conchobar would be both pushing for the law of St. Patrick. And in 823, with the help of Conchobar's son, who had become Bishop of Armagh, both the north and the south was under total reform. In 822, Conchobar would have to crush his first rebellion against him in Slane. In 823, Conchobar and Fedelmid would, in that same year as their official alliance, the Uí Néill would declare war on the kingdom of Eóganachta, to depose and to take their kingdom by force, make an official alliance between each other to enforce the law of St. Patrick. At the same time, Fedelmid was attacking and destroying any church that was not taking part in the reform. He would appear and he would burn the church down, killing its occupants. This was an act of terror for anyone that was not taking part in the reform. In 825, Fedelmid had declared himself Abbot of Munster, and he had declared himself as the spiritual successor of St. Patrick, taking the full embodiment of the reform. However, Niall from Northern Uí Néill would rise up the ranks. He pushed in 827 in the Battle of Letcombe to take over Armagh and put his own brother in the place. And after 3 days of heavy fighting, an exceptionally bloody, grinding battle between two shield walls, Niall pushed through and won the victory he so needed. Niall of the Northern Uí Néill had made himself a name that day that would stand out in the rest of Ireland. He was also in control of Armagh, the spiritual hub of Ireland at the time. The kingdom of Gailline, who stood against the Northern Uí Néill and the rise of Niall, had been severely beaten that day, and Northern Uí Néill would go in and subjugate their kingdom and take it over. This would see the further rise of Niall. Fedelmid also continued his campaign of burning churches as he moved into Meath, into Southern Uí Néill territory, and started burning monastic areas there. This is quite questionable. We're not sure if Fedelmid is purposely attacking the Southern Uí Néill, his own allies, or if he's doing this with the blessing of Conchobar. In 827, Munster and the Southern Uí Néill would have meetings between each other. We're not sure what is said, so what is said is still debated today. However, in 827, after that point, the Southern Uí Néill and the Northern Uí Néill would have proxy wars in the kingdom of Armagh. These proxy wars were a series of battles between two Irish kingdoms, which were referred to as tuits. These tuits would either be supported by the Northern Uí Néill and the Southern Uí Néill. They would both fight each other in the kingdom in between the two. Ultimately, what the Southern Uí Néill and the Northern Uí Néill were pushing for was to lead Armagh, to place their bishop in Armagh. That was their ultimate goal, and Munster was pushing Southern Uí Néill to take full force of this, to take full control of Armagh, so they could continue their reform, the law of St. Patrick. In that same year of 827, the Southern Uí Néill, led by Conchobar, would win a massive victory and take over Armagh. In this, the marriage that the Southern Uí Néill Conchobar had with Connacht would produce a son. This son would be acting Bishop of Armagh. The Southern Uí Néill quite literally ruling Armagh now. This son that was produced a few years earlier between Southern Uí Néill and Connacht showed that Conchobar, with his marriage alliance and his son ruling Armagh, showed that he had full control of all of the north. You see, a few years earlier, the Southern Uí Néill and Connacht had made a marriage alliance. This marriage alliance had produced a son, and now this son was old enough to be placed as Bishop of Armagh. Now that he was Bishop of Armagh, this represented full control. The Southern Uí Néill had a strong marriage alliance between Connacht, and this was represented between a son between the two kingdoms that was in control of Armagh, the spirit of Ireland. However, this was pushed and backed by Fedelmid. Fedelmid, on the other hand, felt that they hadn't reached their full agreement. That agreement was the reform of Ireland, and so in 830, Fedelmid would declare war on the Southern Uí Néill and start burning monastic areas in the north. In 830 of that same year, Fedelmid and Conchobar would both raise armies. Conchobar's army was led by Conchobar's brother, Donogh. Donogh would be killed by Fedelmid's army. In 831 and 832, Fedelmid would raise an army from both Leinster and Munster, a massive army. He would then go on the march over to Slane, burning and destroying as much as he could, marching from Slane over to Clonmacnoise, burning Clonmacnoise all the way up to the church doors and marching back. Clonmacnoise was the main monastic area controlled and owned by the Southern Uí Néill. This vandalism, destruction of their spiritual hub, their personal spiritual hub, was a massive stab to the Southern Uí Néill and really showed Fedelmid was really serious about this reform of the church. However, the Southern Uí Néill would not take Fedelmid's reform seriously, and 10 years later, Fedelmid would be back again in 833, attacking and burning Clonmacnoise down, purposely once again forcing and pushing his reform. However, Conchobar would not be able to reply to this, as he would die from mysterious circumstances in that same year. The men of Scotland, the Vikings of Scotland, the men of Luckland, would also declare war on Uí Néill as well. the Uí Néill were in a difficult position. They were both at war with the Scottish Vikings, the men of Luckland, and they were at war with the Kings of Munster, led by the King of Cashel, Fedelmid, who was pushing for his reform of the church. The Northern Uí Néill, led by Niall, would be quick to take over the kingship of Tara. In this panic, the Southern Uí Néill, who were sandwiched between the Scottish Vikings, the men of Luckland, and by the men of Munster, quickly subjugated themselves to the Northern Uí Néill, led by Niall. Niall was now king of Tara. He was king of the north. In that same year of 833, Niall would raise the levies of the north and bring them to Derry to fight the men of Luckland. Niall would celebrate his cohesion of all these different kingdoms to it together. With his cohesion of kings, he would then force his will in the south, first marching over to Leinster, which was ruled by Munster at the time. He would take Leinster by force and put in his own king in its place that was subjugated to him, taking these territories away from Munster, away from Fedelmid. He would then march over to the Southern Uí Néill. Anyone who did not respect his authority was killed or replaced, or even maimed by having their penis or eyes removed. Fedelmid, who at the time of 835 was in Connacht, enforcing his reforms by slaying the king of brothers, kings themselves, who were not recognizing the reform, was not too delighted to hear that Niall had taken over Leinster, and that winter had plotted to move in and take revenge on Niall. And he did so, and in 836, Fedelmid had raised an army and marched to Kildare, where at the time the Bishop of Armagh was staying. Fedelmid would take him and kidnap him. Fedelmid would then march around Uí Néill territory, causing terror wherever he went, burning the countryside, churches, the clergy, and the kings who did not recognize Fedelmid's reform, taking revenge, seeing it as this being the wrath of God. Then in the later summer of 836, Fedelmid would march his army down to the very bottom of Ireland, down to Cork, where he was not in favour of the rise and expansion of Cork outside of its borders. So Fedelmid went in, sieged Cork, had taken the Bishop of Cork, dragged him back up to Cashel, locked him up and left him starved to death. And in 837, Fedelmid would march back to Connacht and continue his reign of terror, burning and murdering anyone who didn't recognise his reform, as he marched through Ireland, cleansing it of its sins. In 838, Fedelmid would finally reach his peak, as they would hold an assembly between Fedelmid and Niall. There, Niall would recognise Fedelmid as full King of Ireland. Fedelmid would occupy the chair of Clonfert and become Bishop of Clonfert. However, the year of 838, historians debate while Fedelmid marched between Southern Uí Néill territories in Meath up to Brigid, burning and attacking. Was he enforcing his rule, or was he enforcing the law of St. Patrick, the reform? Or perhaps he was even enforcing both. However, in 840, Niall also went in and attacked territories ruled and who had supported Fedelmid in Offaly. Finally, in 841, around the Kildare area, the two sides would meet, Niall and Fedelmid. This was an exciting battle. Two lines, long, coming up and grinding each other, bloody and violent. In the end of the day, Niall, when his side would grind up the other, or flank the sides. Many ways to win that battle there was, and whichever way it was won, Niall had taken it. This was a changing point of Ireland. Niall had beaten Munster. Munster had been beaten down, and he had taken back the kingship. His kingship. However, that victory was also short-lived. In 845, Niall was drowned, once again from mysterious circumstances. Fedelmid would take this opportunity and march up to Clonmacnoise. He would burn it to the ground and march back. However, disturbingly, he would die that night of the flux, bleeding to death in a very disturbing way. To conclude, first off, I was pronouncing Conchobar wrong. It's Conchobar. Second, Eóganachta is the name of the Northern Uí Néill kingdom, and Meath is the name of the Southern Uí Néill kingdom. And if I had made any other mistakes, or if you have any questions, please ask me on YouTube, Reddit, or on Facebook. If I have time, I have no problems replying. I absolutely love this topic. Fedelmid is a humongous topic, and everyone either quickly skips through it or doesn't even mention him. Although he's one of the most important chapters in Viking history. If you were to study Viking history in Ireland, he's definitely something you have to highlight. Furthermore, when people do go through him, two questions always arise, and they're great questions, and they're great questions to debate, and we should have more of these debates. The first one being is why Fedelmid attacks his own Gaelic rather than attack Vikings. Throughout entire of his history, he never once goes out of his way to attack any Viking warbands or the men of Luckland. It's always the Northern Uí Néill. And in that time period, foreigners come in and they settle on the outskirts, which is interesting in itself because these Viking foreigners are not a part of the men of Luckland. Not yet, but they will be. Later on, when Ivor the Boneless and Olaf the White come in. But for the time being, interestingly, these Vikings that settle in the southern parts of Ireland ally themselves. They ally themselves with Cork. They ally themselves with people living around Waterford, becoming the Waterford Vikings, which brings them into Ireland much more easier. The second question is Fedelmid King of Ireland? And that is down to interpretation. What is it to be King of Ireland? If we ask the Uí Néill and their Artrí list, that would be the man who collects all of the cattle throughout all of Ireland. But their list is quite open, as in they do put a lot of people into that list, mostly to identify themselves and their own families as the rightful heirs of Ireland, and not the O'Briens, the O'Brien. How about the O'Brien? Well, that's the O'Brien. Brian Boru, the founder of the O'Brien, would identify himself. Emperor of the Gael is the title he would give himself. And he unified Ireland through brute force, not through cattle tribute. The following one would be his grandson, Murtig O'Brien. Murtig O'Brien identified himself as King of Ireland. He did so by claiming it from the papacy, Scotland through a camel tribute, funny enough, and he got it from Norway through marriage. So globally he identified himself as King of Ireland, but within Ireland itself, many people, especially the Uí Néills, did not identify Murtig O'Brien as King of Ireland. Who gave Fedelmid the title Greater King of Ireland? His own followers did. So the Uí Néill didn't, technically speaking, according to them, recognize his kingship. Or did they? It's not written down that the Uí Néill did. But his own followers in Munster did. So is he the King of Ireland? Once again, it comes down to your interpretation. And I'd love to know what people's interpretation is. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this, the next video I plan on making is on Male Shocknell the First, which in itself should be interesting and should make you ask the question again. Is Male Shocknell King of Ireland? Is the following takeover Flann Sinna? Was he King of Ireland? How about Male Shocknell II? Was Brian Boru King of Ireland? Think about these questions and think about them. coming from the root of this question from Fedelmid. Thank you for listening.